So we have a diverse group of experts here today to bring forth the alternatives or alternative scenarios in which the smart city is going to operate, Smart Mumbai is going to operate. The person who is going to lead this panel discussion is one of the enthusiastic working group members of Mumbai Center of IUDI. I am inviting Samir Chadda to be there on stage. Samir. He has a diverse multinational experience in the field of architecture, urban design, planning, institutional planning. He is really, the whole, from the conception of this panel discussion to getting right people on board and, I'm sure getting right perspectives from those people. Samir, I'm handing over to you for the further discussion. Thank you.
And all these professionals were kind of stuck in their own silos and with few people talking to each other. And now we're again, swinging towards a wider, broader, collaborative kind of approach to things. And so with that, with that kind of a thinking, with what collaboration which Katie kind of left us with in the end, we're looking towards expanding this dialogue towards, not just kind of designers, but who are the different stakeholders of development. So we've collected a mix of public, private and institutional stakeholders for development. These are all people who have a say in what happens. Not only that, I think we have a great group of people here. We've got professionals, we've got activists, NGOs, students. These are all people who are on the table to say, how should we live going forward. So to start off, and expanding kind of beyond urban design, we've got Madhav Pai. If you can come up to the stage, please. So let's hold the applause till the end. Let's just get everyone up. Madhav Pai is the director of Embark Network for Sustainable Transport. He's also the India director for the World Resources Institute Ross Center for Ragiri in Delhi and Gurgaon, TOD, which is Transit Oriented Development in Hubli, Dharwad, and Rickshaw Rising. Madhav has experience leading, designing, and managing urban transport programs and projects in India, Asia, and the US. Second, we call in Avanish Pendarkar. He's an associate director with CS2M Hill and leads the company's urban design and planning department in India. He leads a team of 2 cities, regional and local plans, and urban design strategies. Avanish has worked with public and private sector clients in India, US, Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Next, we call in Mr. Phatak, Mr. Vidyadhar Phatak. He's the man behind the formulation of the 2034 development plan of Mumbai. He's led a team for that. He has worked for the MMRDA in the past for 28 years. He also worked on the regional plan of the Mumbai Metropolitan Region 1996 to 2011. He has been a member of the Planning Commission Task Force on Urban Development in 1983 and National Commission of Urbanization in 1988. He's currently an independent urban planning professional since 2004. We next call on the stage Anubhav Gupta. He serves as the Executive Vice President at Godrej Properties Limited. He comes to us today with a background in architecture, city planning, sustainable building technology, and real estate business administration. He heads design strategy across Godrej's portfolio of 48 projects in 12 cities in India. His global real estate consulting portfolio spans across sectors including commercial, hospitality, healthcare, science and tech, education, transportation, and place brand management. He's a published author and has taught at MIT, Harvard, Tsinghua University, RISD, which is the Rhode Island School of Design, and Columbia University. We hopefully have Neera Adarkar today. Excellent. Neera is a practicing architect and an urban researcher based in Mumbai. Neera's work emerges from a deep concern of social, gender, and urban issues. She's a member of the government-appointed Committee of Experts for Dharavi Redevelopment and has been part of the Syllabus Committee for Architecture of Mumbai University. She's currently chairperson of the Society of Environment and Architecture, which has started at Galleries of Life. Neera has delivered lectures at universities and conferences in Mumbai, Delhi, New York, Chicago, Berkeley, Cornell, Leuven, and Columbia. A lot of places. Mr. Sanjay Bhatia was also stated to be on the panel. He unfortunately had a last-minute commitment. He's, as many of us know, the Vice Chairman and Managing Director of CIDCO. We have in his place Mr. Venu Gopal. He's the additional Chief Planner in CIDCO. He's worked with them for 22 years. He's working on one of the headline projects, which is NAINA, the airport, the new Navi Mumbai airport and the area around, which by the way happens to be larger than Mumbai city itself. So we'll be interested to see how that's coming about and where that's going. And lastly, we'll call upon Dr. Sumit Chaudhary. He's an Indian business executive, entrepreneur, technologist, author, trained musician, international cyclist, and marathon runner. Left brain, right brain, and all muscle. He's the founder, CEO of Gaia Smart Cities, a telecom and IoT solutions company, focused network and IT infrastructure of smart cities. He was the president with Reliance Jio after having worked as CIO as well. Prior to that, he was vice president with IBM, CIO of Reliance Communications, partner and managing director and CEO of KPMG Consulting, Bearing Point in Australia. He recently authored a best-selling book, Rules of the Game, published by Bloomsbury India. The book talks about creating an enjoyable career journey without trudging through life, fearing change, failures, politics, and uncertainty. He works closely with several universities in US and Australia, where he's also visiting faculty. So as you can see, this is a panel that brings us a wealth of experience, insight, drive, and enthusiasm. Let's give them a big hand. I'll lay out 3 statements and questions that will frame our discussion for our panel and for our audience. In the last 70 odd years since independence, India has seen only a handful of new cities, like Chandigarh, Navi Mumbai, or the steel cities of Jamshedpur and Bokaro. In our lifetimes, our cities are beginning to change and transform, aided by a number of forces of urbanization that are unfolding simultaneously. So we are at the cusp of the next chapter of default transformation of cities. This development boom is projected to run a good 20-30 years, going by the durations of intense development in countries like China, Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, or Taiwan when they started off. Rather than this default transformation, rather than accept all these forces of urbanization as business as usual, there is a need to improve the quality of life of the cities, which happens to be one of the lowest in the world. Quality of life, though subjective, can be defined as access to clean water, clean air, electricity, sewage infrastructure, housing, transportation and commute times, basic livelihood, a rich public realm, open spaces, education, health, inclusiveness, and good governance. Prime Minister Modi and ex-New York Governor Michael Bloomberg have echoed the same sentiments recently, that in addition to economic development, our focus must simultaneously be on quality of life. We must question and channelize these forces of development through urban design and through transparent and sensible regulation, so that we create a level playing field for all our stakeholders. So statement 1, we stand at the cusp of a once-in-a-century opportunity to shape our cities. 2, this is an exciting time. Of late, this is the most we've talked about design in new cities. The current government has taken up and brought about the word smart city and 100 smart cities in India. And this has taken up people's imagination. There's a sense of pride and there's a feeling that we've already arrived on the world stage. But what is a smart city? There is no universal definition unless you ask companies like IBM or Cisco, who've got their own departments kind of set up. A common perception is that a smart city is a big computer system with all city departments linked to each other. Rem Koolhaas argues that by calling it smart, the people are condemned to being stupid. The Guardian newspaper in London says smart cities as we know them will destroy democracy. It infers questions like, is it possible to have every citizen part of the system? Or will the transactional nature of new cities create have and have-nots? Will people fall off the bus? How will technology reach everyone? Will technology by itself bring people together or divide them? The Indian government too, amongst other professional and academic voices, has stated in an India Today December 2014 issue, amongst others, that technology, though smart and to be leveraged, is not necessarily at the center of smart urbanization or smart city development. It's about something larger. A quote by one of our panelists, Dr. Sumit Chaudhary, may set a prosaic direction from within technology. He's the only technologist on the panel today. That the strength of a network is in its connections and not in the nodes. The big picture and smaller grassroots networks matter as well. Today we look for more perspectives from a panel. So statement 2. If technology is not at the center of smart urbanization, if tech is only a means to an end, we need to first define that end. The citizens and the government need an expansive definition of a smart city. 3. Mumbai has seen these existing urbanization forces, like we talked about, manifest in new construction, shiny new residential towers, new neighborhoods like BKC, roads like the Eastern Expressway, and transit like the monorail. But quality of life has not kept up with this transformation. In a quality of life, Mercer Quality of Life survey, Mumbai ranked 137th out of 219 countries. Mumbai is behind Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Mexico City. We're equal to Medellin in Colombia and Dakar in Senegal. As a mega city, Mumbai metropolitan region supports the world's third largest cohabiting population. It is inherently smart and sustainable in that achievement. It allows the idea that people can live together, share resources, earn their livelihoods, and reap greater rewards that they would instead by living by themselves. The basic idea of urbanity. It supports culture, a great civilization, cosmopolitan life, rich street life, and a proud can-do attitude. So statement 3, the last one. Like many other metropolitan cities, Mumbai is an uncomfortable city. At the same time, there is an inherent and historical smartness that the city has. So we start with the first question. The first topic is on growth and urban design. And this question is posed to both to Mr. Phatak and to Avanish. How can growth and transformation in Mumbai be managed through urban design? In the 2034 DP, we understand that there are 24 wards and 150 sectors have been introduced for local area planning. If you can talk about how the plan is both top-down and bottom-up.
Mumbai as a city may not be smart, but Mumbai's citizens are very smart. 42% of Mumbai's people live in slums, 20% live in chawls, and they still survive in the city and make the city and themselves prosper. So that's the smartness of the citizens. The problem is that the state cannot match that smartness. What we have done, therefore, is work towards a two-tier planning strategy. That there is a strategic kind of plan for the whole of Mumbai, and then there is a second level of plans which can be done. And some of the very large slum pockets which have not yet been addressed through SRA, they are the priority in terms of dealing with at the local level and in a more participatory and a meaningful way. The second is the concentration of chawls, where today only English plan, English in the sense English language plan exists, which has no 3D, 2D, any kind of physical plan. So such areas are there where there are concentrations of those chawls. So that's the second priority area. And the third which might come up is the heritage precincts, because today the heritage precincts boundary exists but no plan exists in terms of how to deal with the development in those. So I think there is a field created for more local level urban design related activities to happen in Mumbai. The second question is, in the local government, there is no, as of now, there is no capacity to handle such plans. So developing human resources to identify these areas, even if there are a lot of urban design consultants sitting here, but how to make use of their talent and services, you need something in-house. And that is also not yet available in the corporation. So one of IUDI's advocacy activities could be to get that kind of thing going in the local government.
Very often, the way we've actually come about trying to define what urban design is when it comes to carrying out practice is in the form of things like master plans. Because urban design actually resides in all of these things. You have master plan, you have architecture, you've got landscape, you've got land use planning and policy. It's about what approach are you taking to be able to integrate and to be able to build that three-dimensional quality to any of the work that you're doing, which will eventually create great places and which will actually foster a certain quality of life when that outcome is of a certain standard or a quality. I think that's how it can start applying to the idea of planning for Mumbai. So while there is a structure plan, and I like that idea because there is a structure plan that talks about what's the big vision, what's the big mission that we want to achieve, and then you allow the local areas to be able to take things in their own hands, and let's figure out a legal way of being able to kind of allow that planning process to move forward. Oftentimes we talk about doing some planning and then switching it off for the next 20 years before we get on to the next plan. If there is a better way for us to be able to kind of continuously keep that planning going and implementation going, we will probably see much better design solutions come for our city. Ill effects of ill-managed growth, well, there could be several. I mean, sprawl is a very pertinent problem as we are actually going away from Mumbai. Once we don't have the limitations of the city, you're seeing that more sprawl is actually it's actually taking away farmland. It's taking away our natural resources. So if one can look at being able to think about the structure of city from the perspective of being able to manage and contain growth, which is also one of the basis for what smart cities. Yes, I think smart cities are limited in how much they can do and what they can do, and they have to have a certain containment. I think that's one of the very fundamental aspects of making sure that growth as it goes beyond is unsustainable, and we need to be able to manage that sprawl.
Great. Any rejoinders to the question?
Just a quick reaction. I think planners and urban designers both have been obsessed with the idea of containment of growth and containment of cities, containment of densities. These are all outdated things. I think what you need is a framework within which the market can operate. And if you create a situation which is distorting the market, you will distort the cities also. That is what Mumbai has experienced. If you have extremely low FSI, then everybody wants to cheat on you and get more FSI. Mumbai has experienced that in many cases. Then you get a distorted skyline, distorted everything. Then you start building these all kinds of buildings coming up. But if you would have realized that what is the outer envelope that the city wants to have or is likely to have over the next 20 years, then you can bring some disciplines. But if you start off with the notion that urban designers, not even planners, urban designers have all the techniques and tools to contain growth of cities, and I think we are not in the real world.
Now people start comparing cities with cities. Like if you compare Mumbai with Navi Mumbai, now it's like comparing an IIT guy with a kindergarten student. We are just 35 odd years old, and the city's character changes during a course of time. City's character also will change. Possible there are some loopholes. every city will have its positives, every city has its negatives, but it is always scope for improvement, and always the city changes character. Now we are trying to build up. We are trying to build up and trying to set up this thing. And most importantly, that we are also governed by one fact that we are not financed very well. Like if you see Chandigarh, if you see DDA, they are central sponsored cities. We are self-sponsored cities. Like the money comes from the city and then it has to grow. The second point which I would like to talk about, that FSI and all. One thing I am very scared of talking about high-rise buildings. One thing I would like to say is whether this unmanaged growth, whether it is any single professional contribution can stop it. It has got a multidisciplinary results, because if it's unplanned growth happens or that migration happens, you don't have housing stock. So it cannot be said that urban design professionals or urban designers or planning professionals, because of them the unmanaged growth happened, that sort of this thing.
So what we're hearing also is that urban design is an attitude rather than a degree necessarily. And it takes more than urban designers to build a city. And it's really that attitude we're talking about of an integrated planning, an integrated process. We move on to the second topic of the day, which is on mobility and quality of life. So in Mumbai, 52% people walk to work, and this question is to Madhav. 52% people walk to work, but they have to walk with cars, as there's no footpaths or appropriately designed space. Cars occupy 80% of the road right-of-way, though they're only owned by 8% of the population. We've got mega blocks with kind of few roads going in between. Connectivity is challenged there. We're planning some very big projects like coastal roads, flyovers, skywalks. So transportation seems to be the number one issue in city planning. A lot of other things work, especially in Mumbai. Shaded neighborhoods, mixed use, maybe other than BKC, nice architecture, old fishing villages, corner shops and restaurants. But the crush in Mumbai seems to happen on its streets. It restricts life. As a country, we seem to have failed so far to move our masses successfully. What is the solution in Mumbai? What is the low-hanging fruit?
So, thanks. I'll start with this whole walking, and one of the simplest things we can do is parking. Right? On-street parking can actually solve a lot of our problems. Taking away on-street parking. I worked for a few years in the West, and the whole attempt to create mixed use, neighborhoods, what you were describing, we have it all. I think, and if you really take away parking, all of it starts to come together. So that's, I think, sort of the low-hanging, simple solution. It's not a simple solution, it's a difficult solution. But I think it's a solution, and you really have to try to see how you can, and that's where I think the community participation, people actually fighting for it, can start to happen. And, this initiative of Equal Streets and Ragiri and things like that we've started, in partnership with many other organizations, I think begins to let people reimagine open space, roads. That roads are not just for cars, but they are shared spaces. They are the biggest public space in the city, and that people need to think about sharing them much more equitably. In terms of, I think, I'll play to the audience here a little bit and say, I'm a transportation engineer, and I think a lot of urban designers have actually taught transportation engineers and rewrote a lot of sort of how transportation engineering is done. And that's why I'm saying, I think, it's something that we've recently started to talk about, what we are now calling the 30-30 principle of road building or urban street building. Transportation engineering has always come from the highways, we know, and that's where you want speed and wide roads. But I think in urban streets, if you go more than 30 meters wide, it's really hard to cross. If you're building a 100-meter arterial, this is like sprint distance. You have to be a sprint runner to be able to cross a 100-meter arterial. So what we are saying is urban arterials should not be wider than 30 meters and should not be faster than 30 km. And the reason being at 30 kilometers per hour, even if you're hit, by a car, the likelihood of you dying is much lower. From 30 to 40, the likelihood of you dying increases by 90%. And so, since you asked this whole quality of life, one thing is, to be able to stroll nicely. The other thing, which is what we all experience every day, is to not be sort of run over by somebody. And road safety is a central problem in the cities. And so the 30 kilometer becomes a critical sort of limit. And that's where, with 30 meters you can do, if you have 10 meters for walking and cycling, 10 meters for cars, and you can accommodate 2 lanes of 2.75 meters, which is a good standard because you don't want fast roads. You want people consistently moving at 20 kilometers an hour, and you can do that. Which is what all of New York has now reduced from 3.5 meters wide to 2.75 meters. And then you put the remaining 10, 11 meters to prioritize buses. And that way you can significantly increase the capacity of your roads. And so I think this complete mindset change has to come about. And with smart cities and beyond Mumbai, I mean, if you look at Naya Raipur now or Dholera, I mean, if you are going to design a central access road of 200 meters, forget having a city where people can walk, because anything over 60 meters is impossible to cross, right? And then, I think you asked from a quality of life perspective, and, and health becomes a very key sort of link now. It is, I'm in my 30s now, and already, a lot of us are now dealing with things like obesity, diabetes, blood pressure, and I think the simple thing is that if you are able to do 150 minutes of physical activity a week, then you have almost 90% lower chances of facing these kinds of sort of ailments. And if you are within sort of 3 kilometers of public transport and you're able to walk to it, I think you have 90% sort of chance of walking 150 minutes a week. So you see the sort of the connection. And I think that's where I think this whole idea of having a door-to-door connectivity with motorized travel doesn't seem good. I mean, people can walk 3-4 kilometers, I think, fairly easily. I think if we just design the environments for people to walk and cycle 3-4 kilometers, when the obsession of having a last mile connectivity that sort of gets you motorized connectivity to your home, I think is an old idea. I think it's sort of emanates from all of this whole park and ride culture that came out of the US. I think in our context, I think, we really need to think about designing sort of streets, etc., where people can walk, and 3-4 kilometers you can expect people to walk, and people should walk because it's better than running on the treadmill for 30 minutes, which you will have to do if you want a healthy life. So, look, all of us will agree, I mean, that you can't sustain this city with cars and people traveling with cars, right? I mean, and people always say that it's a chicken and egg problem, you want good quality public transport, then, we'll give up our cars and things like that. I think from a health perspective, I think all of us should start giving our cars. That's my point number one. But, if you look at what's the headlines with the new chief minister, coastal road, if I'm a private citizen, I mean, it's very clear I want to buy a car. Because, there's nothing that's been talked about changing sort of the situation of public transport. So I think, but from a priority perspective, I think 2 or 3 simple things in Mumbai. One, if you go and talk to anybody at West, which, BST serves 4 million passengers every day, this number has not gone up, okay? BST was serving 4 million passengers in 1999. 15 years later, after all this growth in travel, BST has not increased its ridership. It's increased the number of buses, not its ridership. Few issues. I mean, BST really has been begging the city for land to develop terminals somewhere between Mahim and Kulaba. Today, every bus, once it's got out of Mahim depot, has to go all the way to Kulaba depot. And they've been asking for terminal space in Mahalakshmi, on Tulsi Pipe, on Ambedkar Road. And that's not, I don't even know if it's in the DP. I mean, I think, we need to give BST prime land on these 3 arterials if we really want to solve. This is number one. This is the simplest, the lowest hanging fruit of transport problems in the city. And we've talked about this. It was part of that high-powered expert committee report. I was a member of it. We talked about it. It was the front. Nothing has been done. I mean, now they're actually saying, DST is also saying, forget DP, it's a long route. Let's just find a way to turn under the flyovers, create space. So, they are also desperate. I think this is one simple thing. This will simply increase our ridership by 20% because you will stop having all these empty buses running up and coming back. All the AC buses are absolutely a failure. I mean, they're being cross-subsidized by the normal buses. They return empty because, once it's 11 o'clock, then there is no traffic, coming north. And all of these buses. So, that's one sort of low-hanging fruit. The other thing is the station areas. I mean, I think simply we need to fix the station areas. I mean, if you're talking about a majority, 7 million people use transport. I think the trains actually function. I mean, one of the success stories of Mumbai is what has been done to revamping the trains. If anybody who's traveled in those crowded trains in the late 90s, I mean, they were, CO2 levels were so high that people used to asphyxiate. But with these new systems where, they've put this suction which is far better than air conditioning, because, air conditioning starts to pour very poorly once crowds increase. So at this high crowd level, these open trains with the suction actually ensures that you actually have really good circulation. And these trains work very well, even in very high density loads. And we still have some people coming from the outside and saying, oh no, put AC trains, close the doors. No, it works well, I think, and the number of sort of accidents, etc. also, overcrowding has gone down by, capacity has increased by 20%, overcrowding has gone down by 5%. And, trains are actually much better to use than they were even 10 years ago. So I think we've done really well, but the station areas are a disaster, right? I mean, everybody, we all know, I use Andheri station all the time. It takes me 15 minutes to get from my platform out to a rickshaw or a bus. And, and that's as much time as it takes me to travel from, say, Dadar to Andheri on a fast train. So, I think station areas, I think these are two top priority. Third thing is parking. I think, instead of coastal road, metro line 2, line 3, whatever, I think, if we tackle these three things, I think we'll be really able to address this. And one last point I'll make and I'll sort of stop. But the other thing is, I think in India all across, I think cycling is just not on the agenda. And, you see, this whole, for example, New York, for many years, New York has been trying to build a Third Avenue subway. And the reason they haven't been able to do it is they don't have the money, right? So New York hasn't been able to build Third Avenue subway because they don't have the money. And overcrowding is a big problem on Second Avenue subway, and so this debate was going on for 40 years. They built a bicycling lane on Second Avenue, 15% modal shift. The crowding problem disappeared, right? So if you're building coastal road, we at least need a 3-meter wide bicycle path on it. Because I think just that kind of a north-south bicycle lane will really enable lots of people to bicycle, and it will transform quite a bit to this whole culture around bicycling. So I think it's a possibility. I think it's with these modern bikes, nice bikes, 8 to 10 kilometers is very easy to bicycle. And in Mumbai, where average trip lengths are 3 and 4 kilometers, I think bicycling can, we really need to enable a bicycling ecosystem. And it's just a non-agenda. If you bring it up also, you're just mocked at. And I think, but all across the West, and, I started on designers, help rethink transportation engineering. The other big group that actually helped rethink transportation engineering was bicycle activists and bicycle activist groups, And I think, that's the other sort of piece that we really need to make it happen in Mumbai. And, really enable to be able to sort of completely move away from this whole sort of paradigm of metro, which I don't want to get into right now, but I think, that's the other big discussion point.
Thanks, Madhav.
Traditionally development plans only have shown the right of way, total right of way. But what we have done now is to allocate that right of way for the footpaths and for all right of ways. This has a very interesting, if you want to reduce the footpath, it will amount to change the development plan. The second point which always comes up when transportation issues are concerned, that integrated land use and transportation planning is very glibly talked about. Everybody speaks about it, nobody practices. No, I think we should look at why does it happen so. You look at planning schools in India, they have a separate course on urban design, separate on urban planning, and separate on transportation planning. When they go out of the school, they don't know each other's language. I've seen these professionals.
Right. Silos.
They are silos. Not only that, if you don't know each other's language, you can't interact. The same thing is taken to government. Now, if you look at the municipal corporation, they have a separate roads and traffic department, they have a separate development plan department, they have something else. And they don't talk to each other. This is how we are addressing the issues of cities and cities management also. When it comes to city management, it's the police who manage the traffic and not the other people. And somehow they seem to be doing good job. That is what Mumbaikars feel. But then the question is that how do you look at these things? That is where and it starts from the educational system itself. How do we educate our people?
I do cycle almost every week, 30-40 kilometers to work. But that being said, when you said that the city needs a cycling lane, We don't want disasters like the cycling lane in BKC. I have not seen a single cycle on that ever.
What would you like to describe what that is?
They cordoned off about 1 meter and put brick lanes on there, so nothing can go over there. Most of the paths have got trees and anything coming there, so not a single cycle can go ever without getting hit by a tree. And you can't get there because there is a parking lane next to it, so you can never get onto that. So anyway, that being said, we need the cycling lanes, and if we don't have lanes, we can just have better use of the same road. It's the speed of the cars and the speed of the cycles are identical. It takes me an hour and a half to go in a cycle, and it takes hour and 20 minutes to go in my car to my office. So it's pretty much by and large the same time. But
Disincentivizing parking. How do we do that?
Taking away parking is a big disincentive. Okay? I mean, I think if again, this is a nice, I was talking to Robin Chase, who's one of our board members, who, was the founder of Zipcar. She was telling me about this story in Paris. All of our buildings now, we are building these underground parking lots, right, which are private. And she was saying that in Paris, for the last 30 years, over the last, 10 years, a large population has given up their cars. And they had a lot of these underground parking built. Now, apparently, these are one of the most dangerous spaces in the city. These are, because 10 years people haven't used it, nobody goes down there, and you never know what's going on. Okay, and it's terrible. There is, infestation problem. So, it's hard to think about something like that when we are fighting for parking. But, this is a reality, and might be possible that we will be dealing with this problem. So, I think the principle for parking is paid, public, right? All parking should be paid, it should be public, and it should be off-street, right? So, if you have to walk 4 blocks, and probably lived in New York, Boston, you walk 5 blocks to Gilpin Park, I think that starts to become a disincentive that you start to walk, you start to make different choices. So, just by doing that and making people pay price of parking, I think you can really disincentivize. It's not easy to enforce it, but if you are able to do it, just making people pay for parking or walk, 10 blocks to get to their car, suddenly you are making different choices on the restaurant you're going to eat, or, whatever. I think, and that becomes a disincentive enough, and it's way cheaper. The problem with something like what London has done, it costs more money to run that system than actually, what the revenue, more or less, it's a quid pro quo. It's not like it's revenue coming into their kitty.
Mayor of Bogota thought he was being very clever. What he did was, he said on certain days to come into the city center, if you had your car number plate which ended in an odd number, you could only, like on Mondays and Tuesdays, you could only bring an odd numbered car into the city center. And other days you could bring an even number. So very quickly everybody bought 2 number plates, essentially, right? I think people are very smart. These have to be efficient mechanisms.
In Bogota, they actually disallowed only the certain number plates in the peak hours. As long as the policy was in the peak hours, actually it was working. And people then just shifted their travel, and people wanted to use the car, shifted their travel. As soon as they made it all day, then people started buying the second car. So it actually worked. See, you really don't want people using the cars in the peak hours, right? And so, you can, I think that just putting those policies, in China now has been, it's very expensive. Shanghai, Beijing, all of these have car options now. In Shanghai, people are paying $8,000, $9,000 to actually buy a permit to buy a car. I think, that's the kind of things then become strong disincentives.
I think the other side is alternatives are important to make for people. I'm sorry, I don't use public transport here. I find it inconvenient. I have a car. I moved from overseas after 12 years. It's the first car I've had to buy because I live in India. I've never had to buy a car ever in my life before. It makes me, it upsets me. But I've tried taking the local train. Now, I think if you took off all the parking and you just simply force people to take the local train, I think the local trains will fall apart. They're already overburdened. So I think, again, I think a lot of things have to happen, whether it's alternatives, whether it's disincentivization, whether it's policy. And I feel like, I agree, there's so many things happening in silos, and I think they need to talk to each other for this problem to be solved. Otherwise, I think it's just academic. But yes, we can talk about this, but I don't see car ownership decreasing anytime. I mean, Pune is becoming the Detroit of India rapidly. It's a pessimistic view. I'm sorry.
Right. Okay, so we've heard some different.
Sorry, just one last point. I mean,
Sure.
which is, I just wanted to also bring it up since this was a smart cities conversation. Today is Open Data Day, and so I wanted to make this point about open data. I mean, that's the other thing that we really need to very quickly do. BST, has a contract with a company called Worldsoft, which actually owns all the fare data and the GPS data for 10 years. And today, I mean, one of not having information about buses and where they go, etc., is one of, fairly big sort of hindrance. So I think opening up data and letting sort of, the entrepreneurial ecosystem to create apps and, those kinds of things. And, you have these classic stories from many cities where they opened the data and there were, 189 apps in 6 weeks that, did give information. So just because today is Open Data Day, I thought I'd make that point. So.
I think I'm the technology guy to completely support that initiative, and that's the fundamental reason with which we started creating the concept of an information grid for the city, both from the network side as well as the information that can be shared and made available for public. The problem with cities is measurement. I mean, you're saying that they should be talking to each other. We need to start measuring things and moving things around. And I think the concept of measuring different things and saying whether it works or not. You made an anecdotal statement about the trains will fall apart. We don't know. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Maybe the 4 feet thing, the incentives. Are we measuring and then taking decisions on public policy? So the public policy debate, public policy measurements and analysis that happens before the policies are made versus after the policies are made. I mean, if you look at what all this coal scam and other things people are talking about, there was ample time to do the policy analysis before those rules were made. But we generally tend to make the rule anecdotally and then we go figure out that it didn't work, then we keep changing it, which is all fine, except that we should have built it into the system that we are going to do a little bit, measure it, change it, and that's what I would define as a smart city, which is constantly measuring itself and putting in processes to improve itself along the way. Instead of stating that this is the goal, this is the end point. I think one of you said there needs to be an end point. There is no end point to a smart city. It is constantly making itself smarter. So we have to put processes in place which will constantly measure our anything, measure growth, measure design, measure speed, measure how many people are going, and then put steps in place, knowing fully well that after I measure and I'm going to correct it, I'm going to change it again.
So we'll shift to the next topic of the day, which is on affordability in design. Now this question is to both to Anubhav and Meera. Mumbai is currently the 16th most expensive real estate market in the world. Okay, that has gone up to, at one time it was the most expensive real estate market in the world. But it is 209th in terms of per capita income. How can we afford it? We've heard the uncomfortable statistic of 40% people living in slums. According to a 2007 report, there's a 99.9% shortage in the EWS housing. And these are people, low to medium scale people who work in the factories, work in their homes, offices, retail sales, and city departments like the police. These people earn 13,000 rupees a month, which basically means that they can afford an apartment of about 6 lakhs of rupees. The developer market typically provides 20 lakhs plus, and that's too in far-flung areas. Thane kind of starts at about 50 lakhs. There's a big disconnect here. So it is a failure of both the government and the masses and the society to house the people, to house the working class. We want the benefits, but we want them kind of away from our sight. We want the labor and services, but we don't want them around. There are a lot of programs in terms of redevelopment, in terms of some redevelopment, and we acknowledge those. A lot of new housing coming up is less than ideal living conditions. It's cookie cutter. So question one to Anubhav. is why is everything so expensive and how can affordability be approached from a perspective? One. Two, especially to Neera, how can the product itself be designed well and what can we learn from history?
So of course ask the developer why is everything so expensive. I'm also the guy, Ravindran said, does not need to understand height. Unfortunately, I'm an urban designer, so I'm trying. So I've got some data points here which actually sound worse than you had. There seems to be a Bloomberg report that says that rated cities in there. It's like a least affordable cities index. Mumbai was on top of it. 308 years it would take for an average income person to buy a 100 square meter enclosure in Mumbai. That's quite scary. The second city was Shanghai. After that was Moscow, and followed by London. So what's interesting, I think, what interested me in that little graphic was the first three cities were all developing country cities. And I've spent a lot of time in London, and it's I think there are two things that are happening between developing countries and developed countries. So in London, when I was living there, we rented a small little apartment. Suddenly, 3 flats in the building just got bought over. So our neighbors changed. That's how we knew. We checked with the local real estate agent and he asked what happened. He said, well, 2 Chinese families, 1 Indian family, their kids had to come study in London. They just came, paid cash down. The apartment was probably going for something like £400,000. They paid 500 and boom, they just bought it. Those apartments probably stay empty about 6 months of the year. The point I'm making is that in those cities, they're paying a globalization premium. In 2009, per person of space consumption was 4.5 meters square per person in Mumbai. In 1984 in Shanghai, it was 3.6 meters square per person. This is because of the Cultural Revolution. And in 2010 in Shanghai, it's become 34 meters square per person. Interesting, right? 10 times. How did that happen? Apparently, the research said that they increased FSI. They took out all the obsolete buildings. They did redevelopment. So why is Mumbai so expensive? Well, I mean, the stupid answer is there is very less land. Not many development opportunities. It's probably the #1 migration city in India. It's the financial capital. Capital markets and real estate markets are not linked. Your yields are at 2%. So if you go and buy an apartment for 8 crores, you can rent it only for 1.5 lakhs. It's just not getting better. So that's why Mumbai is expensive. Okay. As a developer, I think as part of every development, we have to design for EWS. We have to have 20-25% EWS. From our perspective, if you did the math, it's not sustainable, meaning it's in the red. So clearly something has to happen whereby a market-efficient mechanism has to be built to be able to sustain housing. I think, to my mind, our cities, there are very few mega cities in India, and if we are going to be reliant on the ones that we have, I think they're going to expand and sprawl out. And I would say that connectivity would be key to bring people to the city center. You have to move out. It's one thing to say mixed use and mixed income. I think very rich countries are just beginning to do that. I don't think it's possible yet in India.
Okay, great. Yeah.
To respond to this argument of why the city is unaffordable, why it's so expensive, and the reason given mostly is the land scarcity. But I think it hasn't really shown us that if you release the land, the prices come down. And we have definitely 2 instances, and the third instance is likely to happen, First is when the Land Ceiling Act was in force. I know Land Ceiling Act had a lot of loopholes, this and that, so I'm not justifying it, the act itself. But the argument was that so much land is locked under Land Ceiling Act, and if the Land Ceiling Act is repealed, then the prices will come down. We know that did not happen. Secondly, as far as the mill lands were concerned, for a very short while, the mill lands were locked from the point of view of the mill owners, because 1/3 they had to surrender to the city, 1/3 they had to surrender for public housing, and 1/3 was to be kept with them. But since they didn't agree with that, they didn't want to develop the land, and therefore the land was quote unquote locked. So the argument by the developers and the mill owners were that, look, the prices will come down. Why don't you just release this land? Why do you have this compulsion to surrender the land to the city or for the public housing? Yes, they got the judgment exactly as they wanted. The Supreme Court has completely negated the judgment of the High Court. Do you think the prices came down? They did not. And now thirdly, the demand is to release the land under the salt pans. But I don't think that is also going to bring down the cost. So there are some other reasons. Right now I won't go into that. The second part of the question was about the affordable housing design as a product. Interestingly, just last month, a research team of industrial designers from Industrial Design Center, IIT Bombay, exhibited their research and research findings, and it was a very, very well laid out exhibition in IIT. And the research was on affordable housing as a product. And they had come out with many designs, of course, financial solutions and balancing of making it affordable with the help of some trusts and so on. But the designs they came out with were quite interesting, because the team went to various slums, various economically weaker section settlements, and they came out with these solutions which are very different from what we see otherwise, coming out of the slum redevelopment scheme architects, very successful architects who do slum redevelopment, but many of them haven't even entered the slum settlements. And these people, the designers, when they went around and they came out with the solutions, one of the important things was socialization of the household chores. So and of course they did talk to the men and women, although they didn't give so much credit to the women. But there was a demand that there should be common kitchens, there should be common laundries, and there should be, of course, a creche. And they had, it was kind of a walkable apartment, and they had designed it, and they had allotted these spaces. This, in a way, matched some of my findings some years ago when I had done the study of slum settlements and the chawl settlements. Very interestingly, and I think all our smart policymakers and planners should realize that since most of these economically weaker section households are women-headed households, I mean almost 2/3 are women-headed households, which means women are the main earning members, or that as a single, maritally single person looking after a large family. So when you hear the voices of these people and their needs and their aspirations, the first and foremost thing is that they don't see the house as a property. They see it more as subsistence. It's their life. That investment there is not financial investment, but it's a much larger investment. And so they have a lot to say about, not only about the individual tenement, but about the settlement itself. So so what I have found out really matches with what the IIT designers have done. And in addition, as I told you, this particular aspect of not looking at it as a property. And secondly, some of the other community spaces which they demanded is to do with the livelihood. We all know that most of the slums in the city have a very strong characteristic that there is an overlapping of the livelihood activities and the residential activities. Now here, most of the women who are engaged in this kind of livelihood activities do their home-based work. And there was which means they bring the work from the factory and they assemble the units, whatever, and then they return it and they get the money for that. Now there was a demand, a very smart demand from the women that there should be a community space which is sometimes given in the new SRA schemes as well as in the settlement planning. It should be actually for women's workplace, which means the home-based work will be brought in there, which not only would reduce the health hazards at home, because quite often that the material they use for this work is hazardous to health, especially for the children and for the elderly. So in order to do it, plus there is overlapping of work, no rest time for her and so on. So it should be done in that common community hall, which has of course two advantages if you see from the gender perspective. One is that being at the lowest hierarchy of the wage labor market as informal labor, it's a collective strength which is developed when the women are working together. And it's also in the patriarchal system as a victim in the family, this kind of collective strength is very useful. There are many such suggestions which come out of the conversation, the detailed study with the residents of the people, whether men, women, whatever. But I don't think we do that. We assume that we know everything. The planners and designers and architects, they really think that they know all. And so this kind of interaction with the people, trying to know their needs, doesn't happen. Second point is what K.T. Ravindran mentioned, the disconnect between the mill and the mills, what is happening on the mills and the surrounding area, is to do something with the history, because you raised this issue of the sense of history, whether we have that and whether we can use it for our future. So it's not just nostalgia, romanticism, but actually whether we can use certain concepts in the future. Why the disconnect is there between the mill development and the surrounding area is that earlier the livelihood activity is cut off, and earlier because there was a proximity of workspace and the residential space, there was a large number of women, almost 1/3, who participated in the wage labor market, and that kind of it was a very constructive participation in the public life also, including the participation in the freedom struggle, including the participation in the other political movements, union movements. And and in 1934, where the Phoenix Mill stands today, these women had come out to protest against the retrenchment and to demand maternity leave and the creches. Even today we don't have this at the workplaces, but that time they managed to. Every mill had a creche and every mill had to give a maternity leave to the women. So this is due to the mixed neighborhood, and we have many neighborhoods like this, but I think this one example of the textile mill district, I think we should not forget when we are planning a smart city.
We'll move to the next question, next topic, which is we'll zoom in on specifically on smart cities. And we'll start with Dr. Sumit and with Neera again, if you want to put in a word there as well. So there are great success stories for smart sustainable growth in technology, for improving traffic flow, for using GPS. All the new cabs use it, all the phones have it. Ask anyone in Mumbai now, they're like, Google use kar lo, aane ke liye. They're using apps for city services. City services have been connected together. There's 311 in New York, which is connected to a lot of departments. The cell phone has connected people far and wide with voice, video, and a worldwide knowledge database. At the same time, there is not much precedence in planning entire cities from scratch, or entire smart cities or tech cities, the literal definition of a smart city, from scratch. Some examples, Masdar, an isolated area, it's not quite connected, it has scaled back its energy goals. It's finding it hard to attract companies. New Songdo in Korea is only 20% occupied.
and it's attracting people for other reasons than technology. It's kind of a little far away, it's got some space, it's got some nice parks. Smart cities of Dongtan in China and RAK, Ras Al Khaimah in the Middle East, they're indefinitely delayed. Cities like Ordos, Kangbashi, Ujiapu in China, Vijayapur was supposed to be the largest financial center in the world, are built, but they're ghost towns. So questions. Going back to our kind of inherent smartness, kind of starting with that, and either of you can start on that. So what are the few things Mumbai can do? And we're referring to Mumbai as a national city, and a lot of this has impact on national policy and what we're doing as a country as well. And Mumbai is a key city of India. So what can Mumbai do to bring out its inherent smartness? Two, if tech is just an enabler for urbanization, what and how should it enable?
So I just started answering that in my previous response, that a smart city is a city which is, it's not a destination, it's a process and it's a mindset. And we need to start improving ourselves by measuring ourselves and make ourselves smarter over time. So that if I take that as the fundamental block, one of the things that comes about is that you cannot implant a smart city, as you're saying. All the tech cities which are just brand new cities, which are greenfield cities that have really not worked the way it is supposed to be. And I think if you looked at Navi Mumbai and Professor talked about it also, if you try to bring in a brand new things completely from scratch, it takes time to build up, and that is what you were saying, that over a period of time we are going to get smarter over there. Even if you build the smartest of cities outside and there is nobody living there, it does not make sense. It doesn't become smart. Even if you take PKC, where nobody lives, only people go to work, and we put all the smartness in there, it is going to be of only incremental use to people, right? We need to put smartness into brownfield cities, and Mumbai is a classic example of that, where we've got people living. They are inherently smart in many ways, as you were talking about before. They are solving a lot of problems from the grassroots level, and we need to start embedding measurement and improvement at the smallest of levels in all parts of the city, and let this smartness grow in whichever form and shape it is taking, and trying to manage all of it as a network. If we start looking at smartness, if we start looking at cities, if we start looking at anything as a network, we should soon realize that networks are not really managed, they are influenced. And if you try managing networks, you have got the wrong kind of effects that will start happening. So we have to let the network sort of build itself and understand what it is good at. Each part of the slums, each locality has a different characteristics, and we've got to let that characteristics develop the smartness from within that locality and within that space. And tech is just an enabler, as you mentioned. We can use tech to enhance the knowledge that we have got about it, but then we have to use our intelligence to analyze that information and take some useful information from it and do something about it. I think that's what is going to happen. And the inherent growth of Internet of Things, which has happened in the last year or 2 years, where we have started to see things which are not connected are suddenly now getting connected to the network. I mean, you looked at cycles. Earlier cycles, you could not leave a set of cycles on the street and it will get stolen. But now, with technology, you are able to monitor the cycles and where they are. You talked about Zipcar, and it's inherently successful because you are being able to track the cycle, track the car, able to pay for it without having the hassles of it. Uber is successful because they removed the hassle of payment. And if you take cycles, if you take cars, and you try to make it convenient for people, and all enabled by tech, very low tech, it is not high tech at all actually. None of this is high tech. We are able to make cities incrementally smarter. If it works, if cycling works in BKC, let's introduce it in BKC. We don't need to make it all over the place and then say that we have become smart. Let pockets of these smartness start happening, and we will see the convenience that people are going to have spread to other parts of the city. People are going to absorb it. You started the Rahagiri in Delhi, and look what happened. Mumbai said, we want our own Rahagiri, and equal streets happened. And we are going to start seeing these things spread. And Mumbai itself had it in Navi Mumbai, and later on it moved to the other places. And I think we are going to start doing these pockets of growth, and it will grow on itself, like fractals. I think fractals have a very good analogy on how smartness is going to grow. And it is going to end. I think Professor meant something about the constraining factor. Fractals have a way of stopping growth after some time. It will. We as smart, intelligent beings are going to stop growth when the sustaining infrastructure of that area stops feeding that growth. Leaves are always growing, but we don't have giant leaves. They all stop growing after the characteristic of that plant is reached. So we are going to start this behavior change around cities based on what that city and that neighborhood and the locality can sustain. And when it reaches that end point, it will stop by itself. That is what nature forces us to do. Regardless of how much technology we throw at it, nature is going to force us to stop it by itself. And that's a belief that I think I have, and I'm a technology guy, but I know it has its limitations on what it will push.
Well, we like to think that we are neutral and we are non-biased, but it is not like that. We have to actually elaborate upon the objectives, the goals, the approach, the attitude, and unless we do that, in other words, that there has to be some ideological framework behind our thinking about the smart city. And it's not a coincidence that most of the technological innovations have come out of the research during the wartime. So we have to be extremely careful when we are taking it forward. So all of us, the designers, architects, planners, should realize that all our thinking, our perception of the society, which we are actually creating a smart city, is very limited. It's limited because of our class, because of our gender, because of our religion. It is our ideas are shaped due to our background. And I think we have to learn to look beyond ourselves. So all of us, mostly middle class, mostly men, and there is the quote unquote other, and unless we actually think about the needs and aspirations of the other, I think it will be very, very limited. Thirdly, we cannot see our city, the city of Mumbai, in isolation, because it has inherent linkages with most of the rural areas of this country through the multifaceted migrant workers who have come here. And they have created, as K.T. Ravindran pointed out, that they've created some kind of a cosmopolitan composite culture, which is our inherent strength and which is I don't know if I can call it smartness, but it is definitely the inherent strength. And these are the assets which we cannot ignore when we are thinking of the technology from the top. We should stop thinking of looking at a city as a territorial entity. Not just as a physical landscape, but there are people living on this land who have contributed to making of the city through their richness of their experiences. And this is the asset on which we will have to build up our ideas of the smart city.
Any rejoinders?
Small quick question for you actually. What do you think the role of big data is today in helping us planners and urban designers then shape the so-called smart city?
I think it's not about big data as a concept. There is a technology concept called big data. I think there is a bigger concept called information networks. So we talked about bus information being available. Now, if you take that as a network of information, that buses are moving around and I know where it is. And at any point in time, earlier we talked about the fares and the schedule. That is one. Last 10 years we had. But what if we know where they are? Now you couple it on top with another network called where trains are. Couple it with what we already know of where taxis are. You're sitting in a bus, you order a taxi, you know that the taxi will take 10 minutes, this is going to come. These are all networks of information. There are networks of static information and networks of dynamic information. Start combining these things with useful practical applications. Some is public information, some are private information. Some has been given out as PPP projects to one party who is not going to share it. So what are the problems today? The government doesn't share any information. So that's the first problem we've got. RTO information, even if it is available, is not shared with any other department of the government. Forget about, so there is RTO. Then you've got the police. Then you've got traffic information. If we start combining information and make it available just in time for whoever is walking out. So the kinds of technologies that we are talking about right now, when I talk about the smart cities concept that we are going to build, is sensors. For example, you've got a traffic light which is also measuring the traffic density in that area, and you are subscribing to that traffic information only for that period of time. So you subscribe to a tweet from that thing saying there is traffic, don't go, or go. It's a decision that you can take. It's like machines tweeting and telling you what the state of anything is. Or for that matter, air quality. Today there are about 4 air quality stations in the whole country which work. The rest of it is all made up, and they are not in the place where they should be. We can actually have an air quality station in every traffic intersection, and that is telling you what the air quality is in your neighborhood. Water quality. One day there was a measurement that South Mumbai water quality was bad, and it made frontline news in newspapers. Why? We should be measuring water quality all the time, and start publishing water quality every day and see how migration happens of people. Start publishing air quality, and people will change their location of where they live. Look at what has happened in China. They have already realized their air quality problem, and major shifts has happened in population because of that. Right? So we are going to see these things when we start measuring different pieces and combining them productively and making it available through exposure for private parties to use when required. But we also need one more piece, is who's going to build it? Who's going to build it? Who's going to monetize it? The bigger problem today is that, are we going to get the government to build it? It's not going to happen. So we have to figure out the framework by which we are collecting this information, one, privately, making it available privately if possible, with under governance from government and whatever, but also figure out how to monetize this. Monetization of data is what is allowing Barcelona to make a lot of their information available on open data. Is available on many other cities are saying, I'll take my RTO information, make it available. You build applications of parking, fuel and other things on top of it. So it's a combination of information and monetization. So we are filing a patent on this monetization of machine data as well. So if you look at different aspects that we need to work about in open data and in big data, it's about the linkages, common ways of saying that the bus is the bus, because you are going to say the bus is this, and if you say that the bus is something else, then you're lost it. Second thing is geographic information. That is another very common information which is missing in this country, is giving you right maps.
So we move to the final topic of the evening. Hold your questions till after this, and which is on public and private development. And this we will address to the public and the private constituent stakeholder on the table, which is Mr. Venugopal from CIDCO and Anubhav from Godrej. So, as seen as in examples world over, for successful city development, the government and developers need to be individually strong and collaborate effectively on a vision. In India, cities are challenged in delivering basic services like sewage, water, open space, transportation, let alone plan for the future. Many cities. Developers naturally focus on developing areas that are profitable, resulting in the in-between spaces falling through the cracks, like roads, parks, infrastructure. Question. So to upgrade existing cities and make new cities, what should be the role of public and private players, and what common objectives can they work towards? Number one. Number two, specifically at Mr. Venugopal, is how does NAINA, the area around the airport, how is that projected to provide adequate amenities and public realm like open spaces, transit facilities, nature?
First, we will see whether we can evolve a development model by which the fund should come from the project itself, from the land itself. Then only we will move forward. We will prepare a development plan, and then we will take the responsibility implementing the infrastructure also. We did it in Navi Mumbai. The concept was totally different. That was the land given to us. Here the land is not with us. It is like any development plan, any of the area in Maharashtra, or for that reason, any part of the country. So that was the first thing we tried to work out a model by which we said, and the model name is also NAINA. It's a NAINA project, it's a NAINA scheme. as of now. We said that the people had to participate for the development. It is not that nothing comes free in this world. You participate for the project, you contribute for the project. What we are saying, if we are bringing the infrastructure for you, you contribute 40% land to the project. And then on the balance 60% land, you will get FSI of 1.7. And the entire peripheral infrastructure, city level infrastructure, we will be providing. Now, how do we provide that? From where we will get this? This 40% land, out of which 20% will apportion towards the infrastructure development. And the 15% is the land which CIDCO will sell at opportune time to raise the finance for the project. Now, the second question is that what happens if people don't join the participation, don't participate in the scheme? If people don't come with 25 acres land, then people have to contribute for the cost of the infrastructure which we are going to bring in. Second is, as far as the other part you said, amenities and what open spaces, all these facilities CIDCO is taken upon himself to develop them. It will be
so the government, the city will develop
city will do it.
all the common public spaces.
Yeah, common public spaces. But the amenity spaces required within that 60% component which will remain developer, they will develop it. But all the city level infrastructure, it is upon CIDCO to develop it.
And I think the common objectives are to make our cities equitable, livable, and globally competitive, right? The way we see it, or I see it, is, cities are economic engines, and one has to have market-efficient frameworks. Again, some data points. McKinsey did some kind of a report on India's urban awakening. And they said that, look, we really need to step up our infrastructure development. They said that the per capita annual capital spending in urban areas in India was $17. China was $116. And the UK was $391. Now, clearly, in order to sustain development, you have to have return on investment and so on and so forth. And they forecasted that over the next 20 years, India would have to spend $1.2 trillion in city development to make that model feasible, i.e. the cost of development feasible annually. This translates to 0.5, about 0.5% GDP going to 2% GDP annually. That's a huge shift, right? Now, in order to make this happen, all this money, all this investment, I think the public and private sides have to come together. There's no way it could be either or. I also think, I've said this earlier, that the fourth P, the people, participation has to happen. On the public side, of course, I mean, this is a no-brainer. We're looking at things like, setting up policy frameworks which promote, healthy development, planning for public good, a sustainable development framework, looking out for sustainability, affordable housing, all those good things. On the private side, of course, the private sector comes in with a lot of investment, with best practices perhaps, empowering the economy, so on and so forth, maybe technology. Of course, on the people's side, participation is important. I think we are starting to think about enshrining civic pride in our cities, and there is a kind of the last time I was in Delhi, I saw evidence of this. There's almost grassroots planners coming out of the small neighborhoods, whether it's stuff happening in the urban villages in Delhi, places like Khidki and so on and so forth. I don't know if it's sustainable, but I thought it was a good start. So all these four things have to come together in some kind of a framework, and it'll have to be incremental. I think there's no one-shot solutions. Rome wasn't built in a day. I think small pilots are the right way to go, whether it's in technology, whether it's in experimenting, like he's saying that they've got this project of so many acres. It will be piloted at some point.
Can I just add one more thing? When you talked about pilots, I think we should not call them pilots, because sometimes if we talk about a pilot and that pilot goes away and it dies, those are actually the seeds of growth from where the rest of it will happen. We need to start looking at them as the first phase of many such things that will happen. By calling them pilots, actually we are dooming them in the first place. So we need to start calling them as the first phase of many things that will happen, grow from it, learn from it, and sort of build on that concept. Yeah.
I think, Anubhav just quoted all those numbers from the McKinsey report. But I mean, if you look at the McKinsey report, it also expects everybody to have 150 liters of water per day and every city to have 400 kilometers of metro. And it's this whole vision of mega projects and mega projects and mega projects. And then we talk about PPP for mega projects. I think there is some point where we need to change this conversation. I think that's where I think a few of us also need to be responsible. We've also, as as NGOs or non-profit, I always try to work at the project scale. And, whereas, most of the conversations in the big rooms are at the city scale and strategic infrastructure. And I think we need to find a way to go and play in that game and to put out reports that, you quoted the Bloomberg report, the McKinsey report. If you see, the 1 trillion number, you can, if you do rainwater harvesting, if if you're smart about how you manage your efficiencies, if you use bus rapid transit, those numbers can be reduced by 75%. And then, it's a very different conversation of, how much capital is needed and things like that. So I think at some point, we need to be able to sort of, change that conversation of mega projects and talk about PPPs, but not just in the context. And if you see, the new government, if you look at the Chief Minister's presentation, it's talking about 5 metro lines in Navi Mumbai, 3 metro lines in Mumbai. If you add up all of this, the new airport, it is like the new plan for MMR, and that was the Mumbai Next meeting that happened. You're talking about 300,000, 400,000 crores and sort of a PPP agenda for it. And it's not going to solve any of the problems that we talked about, which was affordable housing and accessible transport. Even today, the day Metro, the line 1 increased its fares, ridership dropped. Okay, bus ridership went up. So all the people who, Metro is really prices out the poor. Anybody who has income of less than 15,000 doesn't use the Metro. And so, again, I think, affordability completely goes off the table. So I think my point here is that we just need to change a little. See, also, when we talk about this PPP conversation, we need to find how we can find the space to not talk about just mega projects.
Say that I'm going to give you a footpath, and it's delineated on the DP, and that right away is delineated. Is that something that we're going to be able to kind of follow? It's not something, and just because it's on paper, it doesn't mean that that paper is going to give us that inherent value to follow that in society. So I think that's something that I just wanted to talk about, is how do we allow this kind of informality to come back, into what we feel are accepted processes of what you call the market force. The market force is not a bad thing, but who is the market? The market is not 5 or 6 or 7% of the population. There is a larger market, and there are larger sets of needs for this market. And a lot of it is not based in this kind of conventional, formal set of systems.
The paradigm is already changing. It's not about planning for people. This is planning by people. Okay, and in doing so, the whole idea about encouraging people to come up and contribute to a plan is actually gaining a lot more acceptance, and people are wanting to take the bull by the horns, take the DB by the horns, even if they don't understand what it is, want to engage, want to participate, and want to contribute. This is not only observed in Mumbai, but is also observed in other areas. So if you think that it's only the tier 1 cities in India where this is happening, Bombay, Bangalore, no, it's actually happening at probably several other places in the country where planning work is happening. The second point is, so while there is a movement to be able to try and enable some of that, the other challenge that we oftentimes face is that a lot of the planning that has been done by the government is planning that actually just follows what somebody else had done in the past. Okay, so it's planning by way of legacy. If for example the officer before me actually left 60-meter wide road for an arterial, then I couldn't possibly leave 36-meter wide road for an arterial. I have to leave 60. I think we need to be able to break that issue. I think one of the challenges, and Mr. Phatak has actually advocated for this quite a lot. I know did we, like for example, there are standards that are set out that require the 1979 standards that require you to have X number of plots for banks to be a part of the DP, or X number of plots for a post office to be left as a part of DP, or there are certain amenities that are absolutely required. Now the reality is that the private sector since 1979 has actually contributed in a very big way to be able to providing things like primary school education. Post offices have modernized. They actually can go in within a commercial complex. They can lease spaces. So a lot of those requirements that were set up, over 25, 30 years ago, are no longer valid, but are required by law to be left as a part of the DP. So the reason why a lot of our DP's development plans appear skewed is because we haven't gone back and changed those standards over time. Now there are recommendations in place to change those standards. The government hasn't just acted on it. What you say is absolutely well taken. I think there is a movement that is actually moving in that direction. But while that happens, there is also a very firm look that we need to take about the kinds of standards that we are trying to adopt, and we are not going back and adopting 1979, 1980 kind of standards for DPs that are meant to predict the future for the next 20 years up to 2032.
Somewhere in the whole discussion, what I found missing was any kind of a commentary. And for me, the pet peeve, since this whole new government came in and has been wasting the country's time on this smart city terminology, has been that we're not studying the cultural context, the social context, the strength of our institutions, which is incredibly, it's in tatters. If you look at the way our municipal corporation functions, there are people within the corporation who come and tell us, somebody outside, to take up causes on their behalf with their seniors because they're not able to resolve interdepartmental issues, hierarchical issues. We need to understand, we are a hierarchical society which has so many inherent disadvantages in being able to have vibrant institutions which will ultimately deliver on things. We're talking smart in the context of technology, which is the silliest of things. I think I've been saying since 8 months, and I've been having my own play on the smart city terminology, where I'm saying we need to firstly be a sincere city. If you're not a sincere city, no amount of technology can ever help us. Just to give an example, Dr. Chaudhary mentioned GIS over there. I've been a big GIS fan since I was in the teens, since Doordarshan years, been following documentaries, going for conferences. 5 years back, I had an in-depth meeting with somebody who's managing GIS and BMC. He said, Rishi, we have the whole city's sewerage line mapped up accurately on GIS. But those won't come out in the open because the whole contracting system is held by this clutch of engineers and contractors who want to still work on the paper mode, because that's how they can fudge contracts again and again and again. So these are the kind of things where there is no commentary, and unless we don't get into that, parking was ad nauseum talk, and in the first phase, there's a huge vertical divide in the city right now. I'm on the side of the divide which says that you just cannot get into parking regulation without providing high quality public transport. And nothing stops you. We have the money. What Anubhav said was clearly is being spelled out by hundreds and hundreds of people who come to Mumbai after a long time, and they say this is the first time we are owning cars in our life. Why is that? MMRDA has spent 3,000 crores on a monorail project which has kept getting us nowhere. For the same amount of money, you could have got 1,000 air-conditioned buses. You could have kept a portion aside for meeting the operating loss per kilometer whenever the empty trips are happening in the rivers. You could have provided depot spaces. You could have bought the depot space at commercial market rents, and you could have been transporting 100 times more people than monorail will possibly ever transport. And you would be transporting them on the top 20 arterial corridors of the road. So these are the kind of issues, and these can never get resolved by technology at all. Inherently, we have been inherently insincere about how we are managing our society. So our cities. So I think that is something which we need to, the cultural context, the institutions is very important.
From our perspective, we realize that design has become quite nuanced. And in a typical developer setup, you have just an architect or a couple of architects, coordinating what we call babysitting. So, you hire an architect from the outside and you just check drawings and you make sure it's as per cost and so on. So at Godrej Properties, at least we looked at things quite differently about 2 years ago. We have set up something called the GPL Design Studio. So it operates like a studio, like a design agency within the developer setup. We have urban designers, architects, interior designers, environmental planners, graphic designers, broadcast designers, pretty much every coverable aspect of design. We have these people. It works like a creative agency. It comes together to consult on all projects that we have. And we have quite a few. We certainly think that urban designers add a lot of value, planners add a lot of value, even if it's 10, 15 acre urban infill project. We think looking at it from an urban design perspective to begin with helps a lot in setting up the premise for the architecture or architectural design or landscape design to happen subsequently.
I was just wondering that when we were talking about smart cities, we didn't speak about reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. I mean, MOEF is doing a brilliant job with regards to building greener buildings, and LEED is just a greenwash. So if you follow MOEF, you're going to get a silver rating anyway. But what about setting targets for reduction in carbon dioxide emissions, which UK is doing brilliantly? Number two, that is of course for new development, but for existing development, we don't have any programs to see how much electricity a region is consuming and actually seeing what can be done for reduction of that electricity consumption there. Why is that the case?
So I think what is the problem today is that we have got meters, we've not got meters in most cases, smart meters. Two is smart meters are not smart enough that they don't give you back feedback. They are used only for billing purposes at the back for once a month. If they start giving you feedback every day, you will start changing your consumption pattern, both for water, gas, garbage, sewage. All of these things are potentially measurable, and once we start interacting with these pieces of information, our behavior will change. That is what Heisenberg's uncertainty principle says, that as soon as you start seeing something, you will change what you're doing. And we need to start changing what we are doing by measuring and sending. And that's what we want to... the government, when they talk about technology, they are talking about building this infrastructure. Over time, that you're going to start seeing these things. It's not going to happen immediately. All of these projects are given PPP to some P and some other P. And all of these private Ps are don't sharing information. A lot of Ps there. Right? So we need to start sharing information and making it available for people to start measuring how much carbon dioxide is coming out.
So we're kind of very thankful to them. But just to, not to summarize, but to draw some strains of kind of conversation we've had. So we've started, so I'll make 4 to 5 points. So one, we started with saying that urban design is more of an attitude. We need more than urban designers to kind of work on such a problem. It's a kind of a social, cultural and economic design rolled into one. And this needs different kinds of professionals kind of working together, talking together. Two, in terms of urban design plans, we need more of kind of loose frameworks, which are again informed not only by design, but by economics. Design needs to understand economics, economics needs to understand design. Three, smartness has to start from within. Smartness has to start small, in smaller networks, in brownfields, in existing cities. Big data is all very well, but this is not the only solution. It is not the main solution. Mega projects, mega cities are not the only solution. They may be more efficient users of resources. 4, measurement before policy. Let's kind of, it's a very connected culture and things get around and the word gets around and there's kind of old wives' tales kind of going around. So let's get down to facts and data and then kind of decide how things are going to move ahead. And then 5, in terms of different kind of players together, the government provides the framework, the vision and the regulation. The private sector kind of steps into that framework and moves ahead with it. And very importantly, the citizens provide the participation. It is our kind of responsibility to be stakeholders, to have an active voice, which all of you have provided today as well. So let us give the panel and ourselves a big hand.
Thank you very much. Thank you.